This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Race Day Nutrition webinar. My name is Seth, Coach Seth, as some of you may know me as, and I have got a special guest joining me tonight for the webinar, Brittany Michels. Really pleasure to have her on. She's a good friend of our family, and she's a super talented dietitian and endurance athlete in her own right. And really, she's talking about a really important topic, and questions that I get on a daily basis tend to be focused either on navigating injuries or what should we do from a nutrition standpoint. And so I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and let Brittany take it from here. But I would just say that if you have any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to use the chat box, and Brittany will make sure that she addresses all the questions that you might have tonight. So, and Brittany, just a little bit of a heads up for you, for those who are on the webinar tonight and those who are going to be listening at a later time. The majority of our athletes are training for either the Berlin, Chicago Marine Corps, or New York City marathons. So, and some other smaller races sprinkled in there, but those big city marathons are what the audience is going to primarily consist of. So just to let you know, but without further ado, Brittany, thanks for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. So can I switch slides on here, Seth, or? I think it's all on you.
Well, we're going to try to make you a presenter.
Okay.
So I don't know. You are a presenter, but I don't know that. Yeah, might just be.
You might just. You'll know when to move.
yeah, I'm driving.
So, a little bit about me before we jump in. I have and am a registered dietitian. I've been registered and licensed since 2009. And outside of sports nutrition, I have experience in dietary and herbal supplements, corporate wellness, community education. I've had private practice over the years. I've been in long-term care, hospital, acute care, home care, and maternal and infant education. My personal experience with marathons started in 2007. I ran, my first marathon was the Indianapolis Marathon, and it clearly didn't go very well by the next bullet. I didn't run another one until 2012, and the amount of both nutrition and training knowledge I gained in between that time really supported the reason why I came back to running. So since my coming back from my little hiatus, I ran 2012 Chicago Marathon, and since I consider myself an ultra marathoner, I've run over a dozen ultra marathons between 33 and 63 miles, and I've clocked, I was trying to count, I think I've clocked 17 official marathons. Doesn't count all the marathons I have to do in every ultra marathon training season, but this is definitely a passion of mine. And I threw in there my favorite road marathon is Big Sur. The top left photo is me running Big Sur. Top right is Leadville Marathon at 13,000 elevation. And the bottom two is one of my favorite trail marathons, or it was a 50K, but it was in the gorge of Portland, and I ran up and under all the waterfalls there. So I figured I'd include those pictures.
Beautiful. A little bit different than running the city streets of Chicago, New York, but
yes,
they're beautiful in their own right.
Yes, absolutely. So a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. Obviously, we're talking about race day nutrition, and I just separated these topics into pre-race, during race, and post-recovery. So we're going to get started with pre-race, and As if you run a marathon, you know that you're already getting up very early for a race. And it's even more important to time your wake up around a full meal. So if you're able to get a full meal in, that is the best way to start the day on race day. I always will mention that it's important to focus on pre-race carbohydrates. And this bullet is more focused towards those that consume carbohydrates. I have come across a lot of runners that have tried to do keto or have tried to race low carb. And the recommendations for this presentation are for those that are using carbohydrates as energy. If for some reason you aren't using carbohydrates as energy and you need other recommendations, I have my email at the end of this presentation. You can email me. But for the majority of us, we use carbohydrates as our main fuel. So research suggests that 1.5 to 1.8 grams of carb per pound of body weight pre-race may improve performance. So for example, in a 150-pound person, you're looking at, let me do the numbers really quick. 1.5 times per pound of 150 is 225 grams. And that sounds like a lot pre-race. So many will split this up over several meals. So for example, I put a little example. Some will do a meal 3 to 4 hours pre-race. They'll do a snack 90 minutes to 2 hours pre-race, and then they'll do a final smaller snack 30 to 60 minutes pre-race. When I talk about these recommendations, you guys still have a few more long runs. And it's important that you're testing these things before race day. You never want to do anything new race day.
I think they've heard that before. I think they've heard that before a few times.
I'm pretty sure.
But a lot, right, have a lot of people are doing their 20-miler this upcoming weekend, right, for
Awesome.
Chicago. So that would be a great opportunity, right, Brittany, to really hone in your race day nutrition and pre-race
Absolutely.
nutrition, right?
Yep. And over all the races that I've done, especially those that I go out of town for, I can say right now that most races I wind up having a completely different breakfast just because of what's available to me. If you're going out of town for a race and for some reason you can't pack it, I would plan and try to figure out, I'd sit down and figure out, does the hotel have breakfast? Am I going to have to find a grocery store nearby? You need to figure all these things out before the race. You don't want to wake up in the morning and say, oh my gosh, what should I do?
Yeah,
a banana won't cut it in the morning. So you want to think about these things. Not everyone that performs well hits that 1.5 to 1.8 gram of carb. So that's not a be-all, end-all. I've had races where in the 3 to 4 hours pre-race, I have eggs, for example, I'm a huge fan of, but that is fat and protein. But I've also put carbohydrates in with that meal as well as later as far as the snack and the final snack. So you guys, it's important now, especially since you have a long run coming up still, it's important to experiment there. One rule that most runners, or all runners that I know, they all say that they want to limit fat and fiber. So when you're running, for example, when you have fiber, or honestly anything that you eat within the hour is sitting in your stomach. So imagine a high fiber food. I used to eat bran flakes in college, probably why I didn't run for many years after my first marathon. But consider that fiber sitting and not digesting. Fiber is very dense. it can also be overwhelming on the lining of our intestines if it's jumbling around there for several hours. Blood goes towards our muscles and our digestion is much slower than it should be. So think about those things with fiber. You want low fiber foods, and you want to stay away from high fat meals close to race. You can certainly add them to your meal that's 3 to 4 hours out, but I'd highly suggest avoiding fat 90 to 2 hours post or pre-race. It's just a little bit too close for your body to do well with.
No bacon in the morning before the marathon.
Yeah. I've had some of my best runs with bacon, but it's 3 to 4 hours before, only because there's a little bit of sodium in there. But that is because I've experimented. If you've never experimented with bacon, it's not something you want to start trying. For those that have a sensitive stomach, some will not have any solids morning of if they can't do it. So if you always wake up with queasy stomach during long runs or especially race day, then you should have more liquids than solids, just so that you don't have anything sitting and causing more issues. Those that have sensitive stomachs should also avoid caffeine and artificial sweeteners. Both of those can be inflammatories if our bodies aren't used to it. There are caffeine benefits to running, but if you have a sensitive stomach, it's something that you just need to caution. And the other thing that you want to do pre-race is consider hydration. In a later slide, we're going to figure out how much fluid each of us needs. But the general rule of thumb is that 2 hours prior to exercise, you want to drink between 18 and 20 ounces of fluid if you're not already hydrated. And most of us are not going to be hydrated already when we wake up in the morning of a race, unless we've been freaking out and waking up every couple hours to drink something the night before the race. And I admit that I do that sometimes, but generally most of us are not hydrated. Okay. So our next slide talks about during race nutrition. Again, this presentation is for those that are using carbohydrates as fuel. So the general rule of thumb is that you need 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. I normally, going into a race, will get my little calculator and pen and paper out, and I will calculate how many grams are in my carbohydrate sources. So if you're doing GU or GU type fuel, sports beans, waffles, Gatorade, any of your sports drinks, anything that has carbohydrate in it, I would add it up and figure out if you're in that window. Many that hit walls really early in a race, a wall is carbohydrate depletion in our muscles. So if we're able to continue to give our body carbohydrate as fuel throughout the race, we're less likely to hit a wall. I've had ultra marathons where I didn't hit any walls, but that would be an amazing race of nutrition because most of the time, most of us will hit some sort of wall, but we can get out of it quicker if we're following the rule of carbohydrate. I know for myself that I do best around 42 to 43 grams of carb an hour. That is me testing over and over and over again where I do well. If I'm too low, I'll feel, like I said, like I'm hitting a wall or I'm just in a rut when I'm running. If I do too much, I have stomach issues. Everyone's a little bit different with how they're feeling with carbohydrates, but again, on your long run, I would test where you're at And if you've had long runs in the past and you remember, wow, I felt really good on that run, I always will recommend making little notes for your runs and just sharing what you consumed or drank. And that will help you figure out what rate is best for you. Again, on the next sheet, we're going to talk about fluids, but during race, the general rule of thumb is that for every 15 to 20 minutes, you should be drinking between 4 to 10 ounces, or based on your sweat losses. I have a little calculation on the next page or on the next slide about how to measure your sweat. Is everybody on mute right now?
Yes. You want me to unmute them?
No, somebody was not on mute and it was just noisy. That's all.
Got it. Okay.
You're good now.
Okay, good.
So to measure your sweat rate, because you guys have a run, you don't even need to do a long run for this. When I calculated my sweat rate recently, I was on a treadmill and I only ran 8 miles. Okay? So you don't need a crazy long run to measure your sweat rate. It really all depends on the amount of time you're putting in. So the recommendation, and this is hard sometimes to do, because not all of us start at home with a scale or start in a gym near a scale where they can weigh themselves without clothes on. Okay. So the first step would be to weigh yourself without clothes and shoes before your workout. If you were to get that weight, write it down, and then you would keep track of the fluids you drank during your workouts. So, for example, I generally use a hand bottle, and there's 24 ounces in the bottle. So if I fill that up twice, I'd write that amount of ounces down. So I just try to keep track of what I drink. Step 3 is weigh yourself without clothes and shoes post-workout. So you're finding the difference of your before and your after weight, and you convert it to ounces. So for every pound, it's 16 ounces. You then add the ounces you consumed during your workout. So for example, if I drank a random number, 36 ounces during my workout, and the difference was 3 pounds, say I lost 3 pounds of sweat, then I would do the 16 times 3, and then I'd add the 36 ounces. And that would be my total amount that I lost. That would be my sweat. But in order to figure out hourly sweat rate, I'd have to divide it by the number of hours that I worked out. So I have a very high sweat rate. When I figured it out, I sweat 54 ounces of fluid an hour.
Whoa.
I hope most of you do not sweat that much. But you can imagine, the more we sweat, the harder it is to hydrate, especially in the long term. So for a marathon, and then if you're thinking about, for example, I have a 50-mile race in a couple weeks that has a 17-hour cutoff. The longer we go, the more impossible it is to stay hydrated. So that's why this is so important. You need to know how much sweat you lose in order to make sure you're hydrating enough. And the reason why we need this, research proves that a body weight loss of even 2% from sweat can negatively impact performance. I know races, if I think about all of my marathons and all of my halves and all of the races I've done, those that I did well with hydration have better times than those that I didn't hydrate well. This says we sweat up to 10.5 cups per hour. That's a huge range. I have friends that don't sweat at all when they run. They literally you touch them and they are absolutely dry. I have others like myself who I have squishy shoes and I can wring my clothes out. Okay? So there's a huge range with us runners, and you have to know everyone's going to be completely different with what they need. I wish I could jump on here and say you need exactly this many cups per hour and everybody's the same, but everyone's different, and you have to figure out your sweat rate to figure out what you need for those long runs. The main electrolyte lost in sweat is sodium, and you'll find that sodium is highest in all of your sports drinks. There are very few sports drinks that have other electrolytes higher, at least those that are designed for an athlete. Sodium losses, just like fluid losses, vary, and they vary pretty significantly. So between 30 and 500 milligrams per cup of sweat lost. I'm sure you guys have tried different sports drinks throughout training or in the past, and they all have different amounts of sodium per cup. So this is another thing that you have to experiment with. Not only do you need to know the amount of sweat that you lose, it's good to know what range of sodium you need. And this is something you just have to experiment with to see. Generally, if I get done with a run and I have salt buildup all over my arms, I know that I was a little heavy on the salt for the day. Okay, so that's an easy sign. If I were to wipe my arm and I only feel sweat and there's zero salt buildup, I am probably on the low end of salt. Okay. So again, drinks are going to be very different. I have a drink that I do for most of my runs. It's called Tailwind, but it has 600 milligrams of sodium and 200 milligrams of potassium, but it's for 3 cups. So that would be about 200 milligrams per cup. And I do pretty well there. Sometimes I'll add a little bit more salt into my drink, but most need around that amount. So you can just check what you're drinking. Some won't do any sports drinks. Some will do water and they'll add an electrolyte powder, or they'll do salt tabs or electrolyte tabs. There's a million different ways that you can replete your electrolytes. There is no wrong or right way to do it, but this is another thing you have to experiment with. If you're super sore after a workout, many times it's electrolyte depletion. It's not that our muscles couldn't do the workout. It's just because we haven't replaced the electrolytes that we lost. So that's definitely something you want to look at. Other electrolytes that we lose in our sweat are chloride, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And the chloride and potassium are a little bit higher losses than your magnesium and calcium. Most of us don't need to even look at magnesium and calcium unless we're running really long distances. So next slide, we will talk about post-race recovery. So post-race, when we're coming onto the finish line, there are lots of options. And it's important that you find a protein. So you need 15 to 30 minimum grams of protein to help with muscle repair. Some races are great at this, and some races aren't. And I always, just in case, in my check bag or my drop bag, I will always have some sort of protein powder in a bottle waiting, just in case there isn't protein at the finish line. If I missed my protein, I noticed a huge difference with recovery. Okay, so that is one thing you want to make sure that you pack ahead of time or have a plan with. You want to make sure that within 45 minutes of finishing, you're getting that protein in. So if you think about some of the finish lines, there's been finish lines where it takes me an hour to get to my check bag or my drop. If that's the case, you really have to plan and think about what you're going to have. Post-workout carb rule, most will consume half of their weight in carbohydrates. So a 150-pound person would have 75 grams of carbs. You can consume that pretty quickly if you have the post-race banana, you have pretzels, you have who knows what at the finish line. There's usually super easy to get your carbs in. It's usually the protein that's a little bit harder to find. Post-race, most of us are going to be in a dehydrated state no matter how well we did. So the goal is to drink 16 to 24 ounces for every pound of body weight loss. And again, post-race, it's really hard to know how much weight you lost because most of us don't have a scale packed waiting for us at the finish. So that's something usually I would just recommend drinking as much as you can post-race. And then later on when you get home, if you did a pre-weight before you left the house or the hotel or whatever you did, you could go back and see what the differences are. Otherwise, I would just hydrate as well as you can. And an easy non-scale way to see if you're hydrated is to look at your pee. If it's clear, almost no color, then you're doing a good job with hydration. So I would just continue to drink and hydrate until that's the case. There's usually always going to be post-race alcohol. So I made a note. If you can help it, hold off on the booze at least until you're hydrated. If you can't say that your pee is almost clear, you should hold off until it is. I don't say don't do it later on, but right after the finish is the worst time to have alcohol. It slows down recovery. It may numb you for a minute, but over the long haul, it doesn't help with recovery. Okay. I know that I've definitely taken part in the post-race beer that they have. But especially if your hydration isn't great and you're coming across the line feeling woozy and not feeling great, it definitely will not help with recovery. So next slide is just my question slide. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat your questions and I will try to answer.
Yeah, and Brittany, a couple of things that I would say, and just to provide a little bit of feedback for those who are on and who will be listening at a later time is, if you have a question, I think about the sweat rate, calculating that, that's something that you should definitely dial in and connect with Brittany on. I think that that's just a really invaluable tool and just knowledge to have. I would say that, and Brittany, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that 95% of people training for a race don't know that information.
Right.
And then just kind of wing it and shoot from the hip and go into race day with a inexact strategy for how they're going to fuel. And so I would say knowing that now and figuring that out and just even fine tuning what your race day hydration strategy is going to be will give you an amazing advantage, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's been races, every race I go in with a plan, I would say 0% of them I've ever stuck to my plan. You can imagine a race just in general. There can be a station that you thought had water and it doesn't, or the goo ran out. Like part of the Indianapolis Marathon that I was like so taken aback with is that they ran out of water at mile 15. And I had never run a race before. So the part of my like not returning for several years was because I didn't plan. And not only didn't I plan, but what I thought the race would provide just wasn't there. And you'll never see that happen at big races. Like Chicago would never run out of marathon or run out of water. No,
No,
neither would Berlin or New York. Like that
no.
would be an impossible thing. That would never happen. But it's important with aid stations. You should know how many miles you have in between your aid stations. You can figure out, do I need to carry a bottle? Or can I get all the fluid I need just from the cup or 2 cups that I grab at each aid station? And I would just figure it all out. There's going to be times when you don't stick to the plan. It could be because you're not feeling great and you're out of it. There's been times where even I try to stick to a pace and I'm like trying to read my arm of notes and it's like completely like I don't even know what I'm doing anymore.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But it's always good to arrive at the race with a plan.
Yeah, well, 100%, 100%. And another really great thing that you brought up that is so true is for post race, once you cross the finish line, depending on just, various factors, but I found that when I did the New York City Marathon a couple of years ago, by the time I crossed the finish line to win, I was kind of to the point to where I could get a cab back to my hotel. That was basically right at an hour. And so, it was good because I spent the hour moving and I just didn't sit down. But from a nutrition standpoint, it wasn't ideal, right? So, I mean, take that into consideration. You won't really run into that with Chicago. It wasn't quite as extreme when you cross the
Yeah.
finish line to when you kind of exit, and you can have family and or friends have stuff ready for you, or just stuff in your gear check bag, which I suppose you could do with New York. But for those like who aren't checking bags and won't have nutrition in there for post race, that's something to keep in mind, certainly as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
I've
sure.
heard New York definitely has the most time on the feet post race
Mm.
and the longest longest duration to really anything after.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And then also too, and again, this is going to be mostly for those who are going to be taking this in at a later time. You New York City marathoners, keep in mind too, your start situation is different, right? Where you're going to be getting provided transportation up to Staten Island and arriving at Start Village, where you could be waiting for, gosh, 2-3 hours, right, before your corral sets off. So having a plan in place then too, knowing what time, for example, you're going to be getting on the Midtown bus and what time that is going to be delivering you to Staten Island, to then how much time do you have by the time you get there to when you actually start, and then timing your food. It's a whole thing. And so knowing that and knowing those times are key. And also I would utilize the event websites. One thing that I think we'll talk about in a couple of weeks in our Race Day Ready webinar, but it's certainly relevant for nutrition, is many of you have been training with and bringing your own water and fluids on your runs, whereas maybe you've been using a Camelback or a fuel belt or a handheld, or maybe you've been dropping bottles of water or whatever it is along your route before running. Keep in mind these big events, big races, do not allow Camelbacks, right? So that's something that if that's how you've been carrying your water and fluids, and you were planning on doing that on race day, you need to really kind of call an audible and switch up your plan. Now, fuel belts and handhelds you can do, but again, then too, you run the risk of security has every right to dump those fluids if they feel like it's necessary. I haven't seen that happen, but they do have the right to do that. So these are all things, right, that we need to consider. That like Brittany mentioned, she trains with Tailwind. Well, if something like that, and you've got that pre-made and you're carrying it in your fuel belt, that might get dumped. So these are all things to take into consideration.
Absolutely. And you can also, some races are great with mixing those drinks perfectly and some aren't. And some some of us have food intolerances. I know I can't have Gatorade, which is why I do Tailwind.
Hmm.
But that's another consideration. Is what's being provided on the course something that you can have?
Hmm.
And do you need to carry, like I have to carry my own powders as well. I just mix, almost like I'm mixing my own Gatorade in my hand bottle. Not something that I would really want to do race day, but very few races provide what I can do because of my food intolerances. So if you do have food intolerances, that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And take a peek. For all these big events, primarily Gatorade is the electrolyte beverage on course. And take a look at what's being served as far as gels. I know New York is Honey Stinger. I think Chicago might be the same, but many of you will be bringing your own nutrition during the race, which is great. But if you plan to just use what's on course, then now is the time to practice with that stuff, and not again trying anything new on race day. But I think that for those who are on the webinar now, if you have any questions for Brittany, please feel free to type those in and ask those. You've got Brittany's email. She's a great resource. I've worked with her personally, and she's worked with many of our clients, and so she's very, very good at what she does, and most importantly, she's an endurance athlete herself. So she lives and breathes this type of stuff, and really is an invaluable resource. So, and I would say for those who are going to be listening at a later time, please feel free to either reach out to myself or Brittany with any questions that you might have. But if we do not have any questions while we're on the webinar right now, I just want to thank everybody for jumping on, excuse me, and taking time out of their busy schedules to listen to Brittany present on this really important topic. And Brittany, thank you to you for sharing your expertise, and best of luck
You're
to
welcome.
everybody as you start your taper periods.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Have a good one.